Coming to paperback and e-readers this April, Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door must take on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess in paperback and e-readers this April. Recently, Nadria Tucker, the screenwriter who was terminated from the CW show Superman and Lois, went to the Huffington Post to reiterate her issues with her former employer after they terminated her for allegedly pushing back on allegedly racist and sexist storylines and tropes. Now, when I take a critical examination of your Nadria Tucker's allegations as related to being terminated from the Superman and Lois show for pushing back on these allegedly racist and sexist storylines and tropes, I have to say they might possibly have some merit, being that this is a Greg Berlanti production, and in previous Greg Berlanti productions, we have seen numerous characters presented in racist and sexist ways, such as the bumbling, stumbling Mr. Terrific, who in the comics is considered the world's third smartest man and a brilliant athlete, but is in the show Arrow was presented as, again, a bumbling, stumbling, incompetent homosexual. And in shows like the CW's Riverdale, we saw the Chuck Clayton character, who was presented as a nice guy in the comics and a decent dude, turned into a black brute in the third episode of the CW series adapting the Archie comic book. And we also saw the John Diggle character practically degraded in the CW show Arrow, first being presented as a butler on the show to Oliver Queen and playing that kind of role, even though he was equally skilled and as competent as Oliver Queen, and then him getting the ultimate N-word moment when Oliver Queen tells him he can't be the Green Arrow because being the Green Arrow allows him to be the best man he can be. So there's a history on these CW shows of racism, and that was probably reflected in a lot of the writing in the writers' rooms, and your Nadria Tucker probably thought that she could evade the racism on this set of this show because she probably believed a lot of the rhetoric that was presented on these Berlanti productions and all throughout Hollywood, that there was a lot of diversity and inclusion, and that diversity and inclusion would allow her an opportunity to express herself in an equal way. So, in some ways, I believe your Nadria Tucker drank the Kool-Aid as related to the diversity and inclusion that a lot of Hollywood types like to go out here and talk, but in actuality, there was no real diversity and inclusion. Because if you were in understood Hollywood like I did, because I've been studying Hollywood for over 25 years, I understand there's no real diversity and inclusion. This is something that is pushed on the surface, and the institution of Hollywood is racist and white supremacist, and is, as the media arm of white supremacy, is not about promoting diversity and inclusion in any way, shape, or form. When it comes down to Hollywood, if they go out here and hire a black writer like a Nadria Tucker, they are primarily hiring her in order to be able to meet the affirmative action quotas as related to so-called diversity. And your Nadria Tucker fit the narrative that your white supremacists in the media arm wanted to push. They were able to hire a black woman and kill those two birds as related to the diversity quota with one stone. So they were able to go out here and hire her on the Superman and Lois show in order to meet their diversity quota for hiring a black writer And when they hired that black writer, they did not hire her because she was good at writing scripts. No, they hired her to be in the writer's room, and they hired her so that they could go out here and meet their diversity quota. And sadly, your Nadria Tucker didn't understand that she was just meant to meet that affirmative action quota, and she actually thought she was going to have input on this show. Now, when it comes down to many of these TV shows like Superman and Lois, these shows are really held to a high standard, and they're also very rigid about the way they write their stories. So in this type of show, because it's representing an adaptation of a valuable intellectual property, they're not going to really let you be able to call yourself writing stuff the way you want to write it, and things are going to fold to a very rigid standard. Now, your Nadria Tucker alleges that she had concerns about several what she believed to be racist and sexist plot lines and tropes, but what she doesn't understand is in the comic book paradigm, there is no room for anything as related to identity politics, especially with a high value intellectual property like Superman. There's no room for any sort of push for what people believe to be social justice narratives. People want these characters to remain true to the source material, and with CW already suffering plummeting ratings on shows like Supergirl for pushing what people call SJW and feminist narratives, where the ratings practically drop like a rock, and the Batwoman show practically getting less views than top YouTube channels, there wasn't going to be much of these writers in the writer's room pushing back as related to stories. That wasn't going to be tolerated with the CW already having several shows canceled like Arrow and Supernatural, high-rated shows, and they weren't going to stand for it with all of these other shows practically on the CW lineup struggling. So this writer going out here and thinking that they were going to go and try to push back, she wasn't going to have much room to push back, because as the black woman in the room, she was not going to have much power in the room because they did not hire her to be a major key writer in the writer's room. She was just hired to sit in the writer's room, look at her laptop, and maybe pass a line or two of dialogue. That's primarily the reason why they hire a black writer in Hollywood when they're on a major show. You're just there, again, to meet those affirmative action quotas so people won't call the production a racist production. But Nadria Tucker didn't get that memo, and she continued to push back on things like jokes about the Me Too movement, scenes about female characters that didn't pass the Bechdel test, and the main character being a villain. Now, these jokes about the Me Too movement, these were probably something that you weren't going to be able to push back much on, because again, the Superman and Lois show has to follow a very rigid structure, because comic fans are not going to sit there and put up with what they put up with Supergirl. And CW already knows that it's struggling to get viewers. So what she considered to be racist and sexist plot lines and tropes, again, these are all part of the comic book model, and these are things that you really can't push back too much on. And when she sits there and talks about the Bechdel test, where two characters are sitting there and they're not just talking about men, that's something that really a writer can't really do too much on, because when you're on a production, again, the production is about selling characters and selling stories. So there's not going to be any push as related to, again, this Bechdel test and making strong women. That's just not going to work on a show like Superman and Lois, because the Superman and Lois show is not about the identity politics of feminism, and the Superman and Lois show is about the relationship between Superman and his wife, Lois Lane. So she was on the wrong show talking about how female characters don't pass the Bechdel test. I mean, if she wanted to go and talk about content that passes the Bechdel test, maybe she needs to go work on a production, like if I ever got the money, like an ISIS or an Eastie. Well, not an Eastie because that's a jiggle comedy, but something like Spellbound or something like that, where I have female characters who do have conversations about something other than men. But when you're on a production like Superman and Lois, you need to understand that there are certain tropes to the comic book model and certain elements that fit the comic book paradigm. So there's not much you can do about alleged racism and sexism, because that's just part of the story model. And if you don't like that story model, then this is not the show for you. That's what I would say to a Nadria Tucker. She's sitting there trying to make it where it's about them being so-called racist, but that's Hollywood, and that's the contract you sign with that media arm of white supremacy. When you're on the media arm of white supremacy and you take a job with the media arm of white supremacy, you are working on their terms, not yours. And when you're working on their terms, you have to tell their stories their way. And that's something Nadria Tucker really did not really understand about working on a show like Superman and Lois. You're not going to go on their show and tell them how to write their characters when they've got a proven story model that has been successful for over 80 years. I mean, the story of Superman, even though they're going in a different direction with it, this has, again, a rigid structure to it, and there are certain things that the viewers want to see regarding the Superman character and his wife and his two children. There's certain things that they want to see and certain things the audience wants to see. So you're not going to be able to come in here and try to interject things like identity politics or your social justice narratives or talk about Bechdel test, because that stuff just isn't going to work. Now, when I hear her talking about the main villain being a black character, I can understand her concerns, but the whole thing is, again, this is Berlanti Productions, and Berlanti Productions has a history of presenting black men in a negative light. So she's sitting there getting upset about the black male Lex Luthor, but had she sit down and watched many of Berlanti's productions, she would see that they would go out here and present black men in a negative light. Again, anybody who has sat down and watched Berlanti Productions, Arrow, like I have, and seen John Diggle presented as the butler, seen Mr. Terrific changed from a brilliant athlete and confident, highly intelligent brother to a bumbling, stumbling gay man, or seen your Chuck Clayton from Riverdale turned into from a nice comic book artist into a super black brute who lied on his penis and said that he had sex with white women, they would understand that this is not the production company to sit there and try to challenge these people about how they're presenting a black man as a villain when they have always made an effort to present black men in a negative light. I mean, that's something that has always been on Berlanti Productions, and it's clear to me that, again, she thought she was going to come into Hollywood and she was going to have this impact, but what she didn't understand was that Hollywood, again, the media arm of white supremacy, if you want to do work in that business, you're going to have to follow certain rules. And when you are in the writer's room, you are, again, as the black writer, it's a miracle that you got there in the first place. And the only reason why you are there, again, is because you are there so that they cannot go out here and call them out on the racism that they present. And she sits there and talks about how she wasn't the only woman of color. No, you were the only black woman in the room. And this woman learned the hard way, as the only black woman in the room, you don't really push back on anything, because the media arm of white supremacy, they're not going to allow you to go out here and push back on anything. You have no real power in this whole institution. And again, your job is just to be there, to be the token. And she talked about, how that she wasn't, happy about the black Lex Luthor. I'm not happy about the black Lex Luthor. But I understand my only recourse about the black Lex Luthor is to, if I was writing that show, is to either quit the show or to just walk, or just sit there and put up with it and collect the check. And that's what a lot of black writers do in Hollywood, is they sit there and they collect that check, because they understand they made that compromise with the media arm of white supremacy. And after you make a compromise with the media arm of white supremacy, you don't have a say much on anything, and you don't really have much control over anything. If you want to get control over certain things, you have to go to black productions, and you have to go work on a black production with a black producer. That's the only way you can have maybe some possible say over things. But usually in most writers' rooms, the showrunner runs the show, and the showrunner controls what is eventually produced as related to a script. Now, she also made a concern that said that in addition to the black Lex Luthor, she wanted to talk about how they said there weren't any black people in Canada, and maybe that's a possible racist allegation, but I have many black Canadian viewers, and I also know that there are a lot of black Canadians because I watch a black goth YouTuber who does come from Canada. So she's sitting there telling me that, that there's no black people in Canada. That's what she said, alleges. But I know that there are black people in Canada, and eventually they did manage to find some black people from Canada to finish filming the production. Now, she's sitting there talking about different things, but again, when you're working on a production for a show like this, and you're the black person, you're the bottom of the totem pole. So the smart thing for a black writer, because we don't get those jobs that often, is sometimes you have to keep your mouth shut about certain things in order to keep a job, because shows like Superman and Lois, they don't come along that often, and they don't come along that often because many of these shows, they cost a lot of money. So she's sitting there, again, she was complaining about different things, trying to push back on different things, but she didn't understand her place in the writer's room, and she wants to talk about, again, racist and sexist storylines and tropes, but she didn't really understand this is Berlanti Productions, and on a Berlanti production, this is just how things are. And in Hollywood, again, the media arm of white supremacy, when you're on these shows, there's not much you can do. The only way you're going to have some input is if you are the producer of a show, because it's like I've always said, those who control the money control the media, and those who control the media control the narrative. And your Nadria Tucker didn't understand that she had no control over the money, and she had no control over the media, and she was hired to parrot a narrative for the producers of these shows. And since she didn't want to follow the narrative and toe the line, that's why they cut her. And this is one of the reasons why she's upset, is she thought that, I'm going to come in here and do what I want on some white person's show. But no, the media arm of white supremacy, they will let you know, look, you have no say over anything here. whenever you're working on a commercial project, it's like this. This is our character. This is our property. And we have guidelines for that character. We have guidelines for that character story. We have standards for that story. And we have certain rules for how we're going to do things. And if you don't like the way we do things, we're going to show you the door. And that's what they did in the case of Nadria Tucker. They showed her the door. And while she alleges toxicity is pervasive, this is how things go with the media arm of white supremacy. And if you're going to go out here and take a project with one of these companies like Time Warner, there's not much you can really do about it. Now, if she wanted to go on a production, if I ever had the money, like an ISIS or a John Haynes, maybe she would probably be more comfortable writing those characters, because those characters, they would pass a Bechdel test easily. I mean, you could read an ISIS series book or a Spellbound, and you could see that very easily. And if you have issues as related to different things, but I don't think she would work well on SJS Direct either, because she would start pushing, again, identity politics, and that would be the end of her here. But when you go on somebody's production, it's not your production. You have to follow their rules. You have to follow their guidelines. And if you don't like the way they're working or writing that show, then you're going to have to push yourself away from their keyboard, push yourself away from their laptop, and you're going to have to leave that production. And sadly, your Nadria Tucker wound up talking too much and pushing back too much, and she got pushed right out of Hollywood. Now, if you want to pick up my books featuring strong heroines, like the ISIS series and the Esteem series, you can find those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you also want to try a book featuring a strong, positive black man, you can find the John Haynes series on Amazon.com as well. And you can also find his books on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you want to see me make more videos about comic books, science fiction, and fantasy, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. ISIS, All That Glitters. The goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.